Okay, let me just read the bottom part of this lesson for the day because it kind of summarizes everything for the week. It says, this week, and it's at the very bottom of the Sabbath afternoon. It says, this week we will continue looking at the problem caused by the fall and the desire for human government as opposed to God's governance. These truths are powerfully revealed in the book of Daniel, which shows that God was right when he warned his people about what would happen when they turned away from him and chose earthly monarchs instead. This is exactly what they got: earthly monarchs and sinners lording it over sinners. Never a good combination. That's an excellent statement. Um, well, we all remember where all problems start here is at the Garden of Eden, and it's caused by what? Sin, which was in this case the rebellion of Adam and Eve against God's commandment. Everybody, I think, knows that story extremely well. And from that, of course, stems all of the problems that we have today regarding our living in this world and our worship in this world. I always like this last part of it. It says, they got earthly monarchs and sinners lording it over sinners. Never a good combination. We should remember that. Our leaders are not infallible. Even our leaders in our church are not infallible. And that's something we should all remember. We all have to remember one thing, and that is we need to follow the advice and the wisdom that's given to us by God. And he is the person who is infallible. He is omniscient, he's omnipotent, and he is sovereign. He is everything to us and to all humanity. Does anybody have any questions that we just started with? I think it's pretty obvious what we're going to be dealing with. There's going to be an expansion of course, the concepts we're going to be talking about here. But the bottom line is, I think that first part here that we just went through is pretty good. It gives us a good idea. The very first commandment. The Garden of Eden was a classroom for God's first people, a place where their interaction with the creation would endlessly teach them and their offspring more about the Creator. This is a statement that was given here by Ellen G. White, and she pointed out the holy pair were not only children under the fatherly care of God, but students receiving instruction from the all-wise Creator. The mysteries of the visible universe, the wondrous works of Him which is perfect in knowledge, and this was in Job 37:16, afforded them an exhaustless source of instruction and delight. How many of you have read Patriarchs and Prophets or had read portions of it in our lessons? Quite a few lessons are from Patriarchs and Prophets, and of course the Great Controversy. I read a little bit about the Patriarchs and Prophets. It's a very interesting book. It gives you pretty good details about the prophets that we all know about, like Abraham, and it's very instructive. I wish I had read more of it, but the bottom line is, there's the book. I should read more of it. It says, read Genesis 2:9-17. I could probably start that out today. I'll read Genesis 2:9-17. We're talking about the Garden of Eden and of course the trees here that were planted in the garden by God. And starting with verse 9, it says, and the Lord God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. In the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. A river watering a garden flowed from Eden. From there it separated into four headwaters. The name of the first is of Pishon. It winds through the entire land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is good, aromatic resin, and onyx are also there. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It winds through the entire land of Cush. The name of the third river is the Tigris. It runs along the east side of Asher, and the fourth river is the Euphrates. When I look at the second river, Gihon, I think that's the Nile River. That's my basic understanding of this. And of course, we all know where the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers are. They're in Mesopotamia. Today we would call it Iraq. The Lord God gave the man and took the man and took him or put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. So he made Adam what? The custodian, the person who takes care of the garden. And the Lord God commanded the man, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die." When I first read this, and this is way back here now, I thought, well, if all of the trees have good fruit to eat, I would have probably thought anybody would have just said, okay, I'll just eat one of them, regardless of what tree it was, because they were all good to eat from, right? But, and there's the problem here, there's a commandment that God gave to Adam, and that was, you must not eat of the tree of what? Knowledge of good and evil. Because this is one tree, if you eat of it, it'll cause you some serious problems. And in fact, I think when we all learn about this, there are things that we really don't want to know. Knowledge is not worth having. But once we get into the situation where we're eating of this fruit, we now can actually be what? Able to do good and to do evil. And that's the problem. That's where this whole thing starts. If we were only doing good, would been no problem in this world, right? There would have been no sin. But the fact that we now know good and evil, that's what happened through Adam, we can do evil. And that isn't good. Is that plain? Makes sense, doesn't it? Interesting point that he makes here. And there's a lot of things here which I think really require additional thinking and reading and research. He says, the command not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. How can some knowledge be forbidden? Isn't it always useful to experience to know more? And it says here at the bottom, look at the very bottom, page 20. Think about the kinds of knowledge, even now, that many of us would be better off not knowing. How does this help us understand what was forbidden in Eden? I haven't given this a lot of thought, but I'm sure there's a lot of things in my life that I wish I had never known. And I guess that's true for all of us. There are certain things we should never know. We are better off if we don't know it. But on the other hand, I was thinking, if we don't know of it or don't know about it, then we don't have the ability to avoid it, avoid the problems around us. So I thought there's some price to pay here. Good morning. Hi, Jeffrey. Happy Sabbath to you. Right. That's right. That's right. We don't want it. It's not perfect in our lives. Okay. Good point. But it says here, and this is something I think every one of us needs to remember too. But according to Scripture, God was intent on educating his people thoroughly while sparing them from the long term suffering that some knowledge would cause. Emphasize that again. God was intent on educating his people thoroughly while sparing them from the long term suffering that some knowledge would cause, such as what would happen later when people chose to rule themselves rather than to be ruled by the Lord himself. Okay, we all know about that now from our prior lesson. It says millennia later, thousands of years later, when Israel asked for a king, which in this case God gave them a king, he granted them that. The Lord laid out the consequences, and he informed his people that the decision to step away from his direct rule would last until the end of time. That's the one thing that's very important. Once we have started this process of kingships, monarchs in the world, throughout world history, we're stuck with this. The people of Israel were stuck with it as well here from the very beginning. They decided their fate, and their fate was the consequences of having monarchs throughout their history. And we all know about the history of the monarchs in Israel. There were a lot of bad ones. You remember there were many monarchs who did what? Many kings who did what? Brought about the practice of what? The worship of idols. And did, they were reprimanded many times here. And they never stopped for over 1,000 years. And finally, God got so angry and fed up with this, he said, okay, I'm going to teach you a lesson. Judgment has come. I'm not going to allow this to continue without punishment. And I'm going to do something here which is definitely going to cause you to think about your future and what you have done. And that is, he did what? He brought in Nebuchadnezzar. And he did what with Nebuchadnezzar? He brought him into the Holy Land. And then what did Nebuchadnezzar do? He took over Israel. He took over Jerusalem. He destroyed the temple. And he took the tabernacle and all the ornaments and other kinds of things from the temple and took them back to Babylon, along with several thousand citizens from Babylon or from Jerusalem back to Babylon. And one of the citizens that we read about was Daniel. He definitely did. They woke up in another country next time. Not a very pleasant example of, being punished, because this was a very, very severe one. Not only did they lose their homeland, their culture, their families, but their freedom. And so now they're living in Gentile territory. And the king, in this case, the monarch, the emperor, we can call him all kinds of names, was not a Christian. He did not believe in God, although later on we find out that he does recognize God and the power and his being, which is a very interesting part of the history of Nebuchadnezzar. I kind of wonder if that's going to be something that's going to maybe save him at the time of judgment. He did acknowledge God. I guess it says right here, as the kings of Israel became progressively more wicked, God's covenant people became so worldly and so removed from the purpose that he gave them even more of what they wanted, human government. This is, of course, the thing which we have now dealt with, or we're going to be dealing with, because this is exactly what's going on in our world today, or has been going on for what, several thousand years. There has been a succession of kings and monarchs, emperors, whatever you want to call them, from the time of Christ all the way to now. And in our history, we have had some terrible, terrible leaders who have done things that absolutely are evil. For example, Hitler. Okay, Hitler was a leader in Germany. The Fuhrer, they called him. And what did he do? He promulgated the idea of ethnic cleansing, didn't he? He said, well, maybe our world would be better off, and especially Germany would be better off if all Jews were eliminated or gone. And of course, other inferior people should be removed as well to make our world better, or especially our country better. And that's what he started. His policy of ethnic cleansing resulted in the deaths of millions and millions and millions of Jews. I think the figure they said was over 6 million Jews. But he never, not only did he kill Jews, but he also killed people who were not able to take care of themselves, the indigents or the people who may have been, you know, mentally deficient. He also wiped out many gypsies because he considered them to be inferior as well. So Hitler and his regime, his policies, were extremely evil. And of course, we got involved in this whole process as well because we went to war against Germany, the Nazis, and against the regime. But even today, now, after all the things that have happened in Europe, and of course with the destruction of the Jews, we're still dealing with anti-Semitism in this country and throughout the world. I mean, you hear about it all the time now in the news. Anti-Semitism, anti-Jews. I mean, I don't know when this is all going to end. It's going to end when you know what Jesus comes the second time. But we're still dealing with the problems. They have not been dealt with yet effectively. They have not been erased from our memory. We're still dealing with it. I just hope we don't get worse. The book of Daniel, now remember one thing, it says, not only is the march of empires depicted in the book's visions, we talked about that now, an indictment of the nations. And the nations basically here are the nations, what we call the nations of the Gentiles. These are not Jewish nations or Hebrew or Jewish. These are Gentiles who are not Jewish. And in the sense that we talk about in history, Israel is kind of like an island in the middle of a sea of Gentiles. The Gentiles are the nations, in this case, who surround Israel, which is an island, the land, in this case, in the book of Daniel. And it says here at the very bottom, not only is the march of empires depicted in the book's visions an indictment of the nations, the Gentiles here, it is also an indictment of Israel's failures, their refusal to follow his mitzvot, commandments. Centuries of subjection instead of the freedom first given in Eden would become a new classroom in which willing hearts could witness the striking contrast between the kingdoms of this world and God's kingdoms. Are there any questions about this, or its meaning, or its impact on us and our lives? Yes. Right. We're on Monday and Tuesdays here. It was during the Babylonian captivity through the prophet Daniel that God presented the most compelling description we have of the relationship between his people and the kingdoms of the world. We know his people were no longer autonomous, they lost their freedom. They are now subject to who? Nebuchadnezzar, and of course the rulership in Babylon. So, according to this one paragraph, the the Jews now are what? Reaping the consequences of their what? Refusal to follow the lead of God. They brought this upon themselves, in other words. They are responsible. And I guess that's something we should remember too for ourselves. They didn't necessarily admit that they were responsible for their condition, but the problems in this world are the result of sin. And who are the sinners? That's all of us. So, in a sense, everything that happens in this world, we are somehow responsible for. I think that's something we can learn from this. We can talk about somebody else, but we got to remember we're all responsible. Some way or another, we are all responsible. We can read Daniel 2:31 through 35, and this gives us a sweeping panoramic view of world history until the end of time. What important truths can we learn from this amazing prophecy? I think the one thing that everybody remembers now is that this prophecy that was given here was true. It was proven true. It came to pass. It happened. So, what does that tell us about the scriptures and about prophecy? It says, you believe it because it is true. It's going to happen. That's a very, very important point for us. So, when we have a prophecy that God, Jesus is going to return, we better believe it. He is going to return. But he's also, there's a warning be prepared because if you're not going. Who would read Daniel 2:31 through 35?
You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. That great image whose splendor was the excellent face stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on the feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, and the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floor, and the wind carried them away, so that no trace of them was found. And the stone was stuck. It struck the image because it became a great mountain and filled the earth. Verse 6.
You read it there, that's fine. 2:35. You might want to look on 44 and 45 because this kind of gives you a little bit more explanation of what the stone means, the iron stone. Excuse me, the stone. In the time of the kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. That's very, very important here. It will crush all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. So, when is this going to happen? At the time of the end, God's kingdom will be established, and all of the kingdoms of the earth will be destroyed, and their legacies will be destroyed along with them. So that's going to be a very important point in our lives if we're there to see this, to witness this. This, Thank you. I want to read verse 45 because this is really important for us too here. It says, "This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands. A rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces." Here it is. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true and the interpretation is trustworthy. Well, we know it all came true. So the thing which is important for us is that we should remember one thing. These prophecies are true and we need to believe in them because this is our salvation here at stake. We are being warned. We need to take heed. So what's mentioned here is very important to us. Unfortunately, the Israelites never actually ever followed through, and that was unfortunate for them. So we don't want to be in that situation ourselves. We want to be in a situation where we're ready to receive Jesus. There are lots of things that we can study in history about man's view of himself and his condition, his prospects, and things of that nature. It would take another course here, hours and hours and hours of our time. It would be a very fascinating study because a lot of things have been written about people, our ideas, our concepts of of today or reality, and our ideas about the future. We all have been acquainted with some of those. There's a lot of things about the last 1500, or no, I wouldn't say that many years, the last couple of hundred years, where people have had, tremendous feelings about the future. When technology started to begin after the Industrial Revolution in England, and it started to spread to the other countries, like in the case of the revolution, the United States. The United States took hold real quickly of some of the things that were introduced during the Industrial Revolution. And because of the fact that we had many, many, many entrepreneurial type people in this country with great skills, we were able to develop things in this country which made our country great at the time. Okay, we all know that. That's one of the things that we learned. Everybody saw technology as being what? The thing that would bring prosperity and all kinds of other things to humankind. So everybody said, wow, look at that. Electric lights. Look at what electric lights mean. Light up the room. Look what electricity means. It means it powers equipment. All of these things here follow from technological advances that started in the 1900s. Okay? But the one thing that we should remember that happened during the 1900s, which was really borne out during the First World War, is the fact that this technology enabled mankind to what? Really weaponize military warfare. We use the technology which we picked up here that we're going to use for so-called civilian purposes in our society. We used it to do what? To kill people, to wage war. That's the thing that was most terrifying during the 1900s. We had the First World War, and then we had the Second World War. We had the Korean War. We've had the Vietnam War. We've had the Iraq War. We've had all kinds of wars and conflicts which have consumed millions and millions of people. I think they were saying here in our lesson that 200 million people have been killed in warfare since the beginning of the 1900s, since the First World War. That's a horrible figure. But realize this, our ability now to kill has been enhanced by our so called modern technology, our modern weapons. We can now use a hydrogen bomb or a atomic bomb to destroy a whole city. One bomb can destroy a whole city. That's terrifying. You just have to think about it. Most of us don't know anything about what happened during the Second World War at Hiroshima or Nagasaki, the two cities that were destroyed by atomic bombs. We read a little bit about it, but most people don't really understand what happened. But that was a small scale of what could happen using now more modern weapons, more modern upgraded weapons. I was reading here not long ago that a hydrogen bomb today, the ones that we have the capability of destroying a city like New York, killing 8 million people at one stroke. That's pretty terrifying. And the fact is that we have enough nuclear weapons right now in storage, if they were used, to destroy the Earth. That's pretty terrifying. And that's what I'm saying. That there's enough weapons, nuclear weapons now in this world that if they were used in conflict, in a worldwide conflict, that we could destroy the Earth, the population of the Earth. That's horrifying. And you would think that our leaders in the world would be cognizant of the impact of these kinds of things and want to do everything possible to make sure that we would do what? Avoid the use of these weapons. And in fact, maybe eliminate these weapons. But so far, our so called leaders have been unable to do so. And that is in all the countries that we know about that have nuclear weapons. Everybody thinks that a nuclear weapon is what? A deterrent. But to me, it's the most fearful thing that you can think of. I mean, I can interject here a little bit of history here. One of the things that we did during the 1950s and 60s is we had this theory, this policy. We call it mutually assured destruction. We call it MAD. You remember that? Our leaders said, well, we're going to make more and more nuclear weapons and more missiles to put those weapons in. So that if anybody decides they want to attack us, they're going to be attacked in return with weapons that will destroy them. So nobody should be able to do this to us, think that they can do this to us without the kinds of consequences that we're talking about. We call it mutually assured destruction. You start this, we're gonna respond. And what's gonna happen to us both if we do this is probably we're both going to be destroyed. That's what we are dealing with. Now notice here in our history, just recently in the last couple of terms of presidents, they're talking about one thing: disarmament, reducing the number of nuclear weapons. But I don't know whether or not that's going to really happen or what kind of consequence we're going to be looking at here as a result of efforts to try to remove those weapons. You know, I had great hope when I was a young kid about the United Nations, you know, an organization that comprises all the nations of the world, having this power and this ability to stop conflicts and other kinds of problems in this world, to solve these problems. But so far, since the 1940s, that hasn't happened. So mankind, yeah, has great aspirations, but his abilities in terms of the ability to stop this or to do something very positive has been very, very limited and not very successful. I think that we've had great leaders in the world, but their intentions haven't been fulfilled. Look at our country right now. We have different administrations. Everyone's saying we can just solve the problems that were done by that administration or by that president. But what kind of thing is going to happen as a result of that? I'm not really sure. Interesting point here. It says this is a paraphrase of Martin Luther King's statements. He said, "We have guided missiles, but misguided men." And that's a very scary combination. And that is really what we're dealing with in this world today. Notice one thing too, in the Daniel 2, in a vision that was not a Nebuchadnezzar's vision. The metals that were listed here, gold, silver, brass, iron, are declining in value. Gold was the most valuable. That started with who? Nebuchadnezzar. And then the next one down was silver in the arms and the chest was silver. Silver is not as valuable as gold. What does silver gold represent? Which empire or country? Monarch? It represents the Greeks. And who would the Greeks be here that would be mentioned? The Greeks of Alexander the Great. Then the next one in value is what? Brass. Oh, silver is, yeah, the Medes and Persians. Yeah. Bronze would be the, would be the I guess it would be the Greeks. Excuse me. Very good. Okay. So that's lesser in value. And then we get down to the next empire, and it's iron. Now, iron is, we know that iron is strong, but its value in terms of its material value, its commercial value, it's, it's not going to bring on the kinds of things that you can use gold for or silver for in terms of exchange of goods. But iron represents something that's very strong. And who is the one who's strong later on? It's Rome, because Rome is a great conqueror. From a couple hundred centuries, a couple hundred years before Christ, Rome was the ruling empire. But eventually, even Rome did what? It disintegrated, not really disintegrated, it kind of separated into various nations. And those nations are represented by what? The 10 toes on the feet of the statue. And they are what? A combination of what kinds of things? Potter's clay and iron, which is not a really strong combination, but they represent the nations of Rome after Rome separates. One thing here at the very bottom is very interesting to me. Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, and other 19th century thinkers attempted to convince us that humanity is somehow tracking upward. In other words, we're getting better because of evolution and in terms of things that are happening in our society. Technology, learning, everything else is making it better. So we're supposedly tracking upward. We're not like, base animals anymore. We're getting better and better. That we are evolving biologically and socially. I think I can admit to that. And though in some human ways, existence, I should say, has improved, at least at a physical level, who actually looks ahead to the future of the world as it is now ruled and governed with much optimism about peace, security, and prosperity? Well, I'll tell you what, we all have this kind of thing that we're thinking about. Every one of us is worried about the future. Our future, our children's future, the future of our church. Everybody is concerned about that. There's no doubt about that. And of course, along with it, we're concerned about the leadership, the people who could take us there to make it better. So I had a little thing down here, my little question mark myself. What about the future of the United States? This is a lesson about, okay, empires, nations. What about the United States, the future of the United States? We live here in the United States. What about our future? What about the future of our country? There's a lot of people that don't like to talk about that. I hear about it and I watch the news and I'm thinking, my gosh, if the noise that we're hearing on TV represents what's going to happen to us in the future, I don't want to be part of that future. That's really terrifying. I mean, good gosh, all you have to do is just watch CNN during the evening sessions where they have these panels and you say, wow, wow. Everybody's yelling and screaming at each other. You can hardly understand what's going on. But that's what they are saying is going to be like our nation in the future. I don't want to have any part of that. That's really terrifying. The dream of Daniel is a little bit different. God reveals to Daniel in his dream, his vision, the kinds of things which Nebuchadnezzar dealt with, his statue. But in the situation here, God uses what? Beasts from the sea to do what? To describe the succession here of nations in Earth's history. He talks about beasts. We know one thing, beasts represent what? Kingdoms and nations. That's from the Bible. Beasts represent kingdoms and nations. The sea is what? What does sea represent? The people? Okay, we all know what land is. So we're all talking about the same thing here that Nebuchadnezzar learned, but now we're talking about it in a different sense in terms of historical succession of empires or kingships or monarchs. It says that Daniel is shown the same subject as was Nebuchadnezzar, but from a different perspective. Instead of a statue, he sees a series of nations rising up out of the sea. Okay, and these are again beasts, the result of wind turning up the water. These nations were in a continual state of strife, causing a perpetual shift in power among them. And it says in Psalms and Isaiah and Jeremiah, they use the analogy of floods and waves to depict the tumult, the turmoil among the nations. In contrast, the promised land existed, at least for a period of time, that is Israel, the land which God, of course, gave the Jews, as an island of peace and safety amid a sea of Gentile kingdoms. And we remember the Gentile kingdoms are the nations which surrounded Israel. And of course, we know that Israel was a sacred nation because this was a nation of the covenant people of God, the Jews. And it was established on the solid foundation of God's government. As you remember, God wanted the Jews to be what? An example to their neighbors. By their actions, by the way which they conducted themselves, they were to influence their neighbors in a manner which would be good. So, in other words, by living a good life, by having good leaders, other nations, other peoples would be attracted to those nations or to the Jews, to the Israels. But unfortunately, the Jews did not live up to the promise. So Daniel watches the chaos of Gentile warfare from the shore. When suddenly the beasts start coming up on the land into his territory. Gentile problems have now become his people's problems. They had chosen to live like Gentiles, so now they would live with and under Gentiles. Starting with Babylonian domination, God's covenant people never again enjoyed complete or long lasting autonomy. And that is very, very much important today. Starting with Babylonian domination, God's covenant people never again enjoyed complete or long lasting autonomy. You know, I've been thinking about what's happening right now in Israel and in Palestine, like the Gaza issue, and I'm saying to myself, my gosh almighty, the poor people in Gaza are suffering the kind of thing which the Jews did at the time of the Nebuchadnezzar, at the time when the Babylonians conquered their nation. What's happening to the people in Palestine today is very, very similar to what happened to the Jews in the time of Nebuchadnezzar. And of course, after that, their history of the other leaders of the other nations who dominated Israel. So, in a sense, what's going on in Israel today is an extension of the things which happened to Israel of old. Only now the other people involved, the other citizens involved here, are the Palestinians, the Arabs. I guess you would call them Arabs, but I call them Palestinians to make sure we understand where they come from. But they are doing right now, suffering the same kinds of things which the Jews suffered. I just hope that the situation in Palestine can be solved peaceably and amicably with good, good leadership on both sides and a promise for peace and prosperity for all. That's the same thing that was wished back in the time of, I'm sure, of Daniel. I hope that comes true. It says this loss of autonomy for for God's people today will persist until the close of time, when Christ is finally restored to his rightful place as our King, his second coming. It says in his New Testament, God's people continue to suffer under the thumb of Roman Empire and then under the persecutions of the little horn, pagan Rome's successor. And you remember the history of the church, of the Catholic Church, of the papacy, all the way from, we'll say, 300 BC or 300 AD, all the way until about 17 or 1800, was when there was a lot of bloodshed. We read about it in our history books, but there was tremendous bloodshed, purges. And I think I read a figure one time that the number of people who were killed during the period of the papacy was well into the 20 or 30 or 40 million mark. That's a lot of people who were killed because of the fact that there was disagreements within the church group about the teachings which were given at that time by the church, the Catholic Church, by the priests. There was a lot of disagreement among many of the people, especially those who did what? Read and studied the Bible and accepted God's word as the true word. In other words, sola scriptura. They believed what the Bible said. And that was the thing which basically made them different than some of the others in the church who just basically followed whatever the Pope said was acceptable. And even then, we all remember the Pope even was responsible for what? Changing the law, changing things like Sunday worship in this case instead of Saturday worship. I think we can all agree with the last part of this. It says, though historically some nations have been better than others, and some eras have been more peaceful than others, the vast majority of the history of nations, peoples, and empires has simply been going from one tragedy to another, from one oppression to another. And often this is done under rulers claiming only the best of intentions for their own people. And here's the issue here. What a contrast to the rule that God had wanted for his people. If only they would have chosen it. If they had chosen originally to want to have been ruled by God and his kingdom, mankind would be far better off than it is today. Are there any questions about that?
We stay together until the end of time.
Right. I wanted to just look at the Wednesday Thursday combination here a little bit. It says the Seventh Day Adventists have understood Revelation 12:16, which talks about the water and what happened, refers to the migration of persecuted believers to the New World. If our understanding of land and sea is correct, what does this say about the founding of the American Republic? Where did the original people come from that settled in America? They came from where? Europe and England, right? Principally England. Okay, England is what? A nation, an island nation, and people who came from England or Europe had to cross what? The ocean, which is the seas right here in this case, represents the seas. It's interesting to see that you can make this kind of connection between religion in this country here, how it formed, and the things in biblical, in this case, history. It says, could we consider it to be the earth in the same way that the promised land was a place set aside for God's people? Could this be why the land beast first appears to be lamb like? Though America has never been the new Israel, as some of its early founders like to see it, for a long time it has been a land of religious freedom for millions of the world's religiously oppressed. Okay? And here's the last part of this, which really kind of disturbed me a bit. Unfortunately, this lamb like beast will one day speak like a dragon. This is in Revelations 13:11, which you have in your lesson. The United States, along a beacon of religious freedom for the persecuted, because they remember our nation was founded on the idea of religious liberty and all the freedoms that are expressed in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, will become the dominant religious persecutor. This is another example of what happened when humanity chose to rule itself instead of being ruled by God. I wrote down in my own notes here on this is that I don't understand this and I don't like this prophecy. That's really terrifying. That America is going to be the dominant religious persecutor. That is to me very scary. How is that going to happen? I don't want to be a part of that because I do believe in freedom of religion. And I don't care if you're a Muslim, Catholic, Buddhist, or whatever. You have that right in our country. And I certainly don't want to be part of a group that is going to be a religious persecutor against any religious denomination. Yes, but for our nation, right, right, that's right. You're right. And in closing, yes, you're good. Thank you. And in closing, one of the things which we all know is that our mission, not necessarily as a nation, but as a church, will be to spread the gospel to all the nations, to all the languages, to all the peoples, to all the tribes, and whatever we want to call them, groups in the world. That's the kind of thing that follows through on this. This is our basic mission. And that mission is actually what? Described in a sense in chapter 14 of Revelation, right? The three angels' messages. And we're to carry on as Adventists in the same. We call ourselves what? The remnant church, the remnant group. We are the remnant group. Our mission is to do what? To help spread the good news to all of these nations of the world, to all other peoples, nations, creeds, ethnic groups, whatever we want to call them, of the world. Well, I guess that's all I've got here. I thought this was kind of a very interesting lesson. It's a little bit more complicated than I'm used to actually discussing, but I think it was a good lesson. We could probably talk about some of these things on other occasions because there are some really important things that are going on today in our world, which relate directly to what we have just learned or studying right now. Yeah, lots to study. Who will give us a short closing prayer? Can I pick on somebody? Can I can I pick on Micah? Man,